there's something missing in you, and you don't even know what to call it anymore. It's not depression, it's not burnout, it's deeper than that, a kind of silence that no noise can fill. You function, you show up, but something sacred inside you has gone quiet, and no one talks about it. A sense that something sacred has gone missing. There is a God-shaped hunger in the modern human, but the God is gone. Not just the idea of a deity, but the entire symbolic fabric that once gave the soul something to press its forehead against. We didn't kill the sacred with violence. We buried it with indifference. We replaced temples with screens, reverence with branding, myths with metrics. And somewhere in that transition, something ancient slipped away unnoticed. We didn't mean to lose it. It just stopped making sense. Or rather, we became too rational to kneel. Carl Jung once said, "The gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but rather the solar plexus, and produces curious specimens for the doctor's consulting room." What was once sacred became psychological. What was once mystery became diagnosis. We translated everything into explanation. But the ache, the raw, existential ache, remains untranslatable. You can call it a void. You can call it the loss of myth. You can call it spiritual dryness. It doesn't matter what you name it. The truth is, you're not looking for a label. You're looking for something to kneel before. Not out of fear, not because you feel small, but because part of you knows. You were not made to carry everything alone. That part of you remembers altars, even if your mind doesn't. It remembers sacredness. It remembers awe. It remembers the kind of silence that doesn't crush, but holds. But we live in a time where silence has been replaced with stimulation. If the ancient soul was once surrounded by stories, mystery, ritual, today it is surrounded by data, speed, and self-marketing. We've turned ourselves into projects, our healing into timelines, our value into metrics. Even our pain has been optimized, marketed, branded. Turn your trauma into purpose. Grow through what you go through. Make your mess your message. But not all pain needs to become a TED Talk. Some wounds are not meant to be capitalized. Some sacred longings are not meant to be explained. They just want to be witnessed. They want silence. They want reverence. But the modern world has no patience for reverence. Everything must be processed, fixed, solved, shared. And so the ache deepens, not because we are broken, but because we've lost the container for what it means to be whole. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves." But we don't love the questions anymore. We rush toward the answers, even if they're empty. You scroll, you consume, you work on yourself, you perform vulnerability, you meditate, journal, self-care, and still, in the quiet moments, it returns. That hum, that hollowness, that sacred absence you can't seem to name. It's not a failure, it's not a flaw. It's the echo of what used to be sacred in us and is now simply missing. And yet, sometimes, even now, you catch a glimpse, not in grand moments, but in the quiet ones. When the world stops spinning, when grief breaks you open, or awe washes over you unexpectedly, you feel it. A stillness that doesn't feel empty, but full. A sense that something is listening, even if it never speaks. Simone Weil once wrote, "Absolutely unmixed attention is prayer." Maybe that's all that's left. Not belief, not answers, just attention. Not the kind of attention the world rewards, not hustle, not hyper-focus, but the soft, trembling attention of one who dares to sit with the ache that refuses to leave. Because maybe the goal isn't to escape the hunger. Maybe the hunger is holy. Maybe it was never about finding a God who speaks. Maybe it's about remembering how to listen to the silence. And maybe, just maybe, if we stay long enough in that silence, we start to feel less alone. Not because something outside us arrives, but because something inside us returns. Not belief, not faith, just presence. The willingness to keep listening to a God that no longer speaks. The silence grows deeper the more we resist it. And so we don't. We fill it. With movement, with screens, with commentary, with improvement. Always improving. Always optimizing. But healing, real healing, the kind that touches the bone, has never come through optimization. It comes through surrender. The modern world has sold us 1,000 upgrades to ourselves. Faster, sharper, healthier, happier. And yet the soul continues to starve. Because hunger for the sacred isn't satisfied by self-improvement. It's not a lack of productivity. It's a lack of presence. We are fed content instead of contact, motivation instead of meaning, dopamine instead of devotion. We no longer know how to kneel, not in front of a God, but in front of a moment, in front of death, in front of birth, in front of a face that has known suffering and chosen to stay soft. We have lost the posture of reverence, because reverence can't be monetized, it can't be scheduled, it doesn't scale, it's not efficient, it just is, like the way trees stand, or the way grief arrives with no permission. Reverence is slow, it interrupts, it makes you small in a beautiful way, and we have forgotten how to be small. We were trained to believe that being small is being powerless, that we must constantly expand, dominate, grow our reach, own our story. But some stories were never meant to be owned. They were meant to be shared, lived, held. And when we reduce everything, even our souls, into brand identities and curated narratives, we lose something immeasurable. We lose the parts of ourselves that are not explainable, the ineffable. Nietzsche once warned, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what happens when there is no why? When all the old whys have dissolved? Not just religion, but the symbols that carried us. The mythic scaffolding that gave form to our longing. We think we've evolved past myth. But myth wasn't primitive. It was poetic. It spoke to the parts of us that logic could never touch. Joseph Campbell said, "Myths are public dreams. Dreams are private myths." And now even our dreams are crowded, filled with influencers, metrics, noise. We don't dream anymore. We scroll. We don't seek the sacred. We search the feed. And the soul, meanwhile, waits. Quietly. Not because it has disappeared, but because it refuses to compete with the volume. The sacred is shy. It does not perform. It does not advertise. It waits for slowness. It waits for honesty. It waits for emptiness. And we are terrified of being empty. Because to be empty is to admit we don't know. And to not know is an act of rebellion in a world that worships certainty. But certainty has never been a requirement for awe. Sometimes all that is required is to look at the stars without asking for a single answer. To feel something rise in your chest. Not hope, not faith, but simply the willingness to be present to what cannot be explained. We were not made to explain everything. We were not designed to conquer mystery. We were made to live with it, to walk beside it, to let it shape us. And this is where the ache leads us. Not to solutions, but to thresholds. to the edge of knowing, where the mind gives up and the soul begins to see, not clearly, but truly. We live in a world that trusts only what it can prove, only what it can measure, only what it can monetize. But the most important parts of being human cannot be proven. They cannot be charted. They cannot be made efficient. Love, wonder, grief, reverence, stillness. These are not useful, but they are essential. And so we starve, not for lack of resources, but for lack of depth. We no longer descend. We skim. We move fast. We consume faster. Even spirituality has become a service, a menu. Pick your practice, pick your affirmation, pick your God, and if none of it works, return it for a better version. But the soul is not a product, and awakening is not a purchase. It's not convenient. It doesn't come with clarity. It comes with unraveling, with losing what once made sense, with sitting inside a question that may never resolve. Alan Watts once said, "You are under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago." But to truly change, to truly transform, is not a rebranding. It is a quiet collapse, a loss of identity, a shedding of all the roles we perform just to be loved. And in that shedding, we come face to face with the hunger, not for pleasure, not for success, not even for peace, but for something unnameable, something sacred, something that feels like home, even though we've never touched it. You might feel it in a forest, in the eyes of a dying parent, in the breath of a newborn, in a piece of music that stops your thinking, in a moment of surrender when you realize you cannot fix it. And for once, you stop trying. That is not weakness, that is worship. Even if no one sees it, even if no one blesses it, even if there is no God to receive it. Because maybe worship was never about the object. Maybe it was always about the posture. The willingness to kneel not in submission, but in respect for something larger than the self. We don't have that anymore. We are told the self is the center of everything, that all answers lie within, that we are our own source. But the soul isn't fed by praise. It's fed by participation, by standing in relation to something unknowable. We've replaced reverence with control, and control is hungry. It needs certainty. It needs logic. It needs an outcome. But mystery doesn't owe us anything. It doesn't arrive when called. It doesn't explain itself. It just is. And when we deny it, when we flatten the world into problems to solve and images to project, we become emotionally malnourished. Not because we are broken, but because we were made to kneel in front of something we do not understand, made to be humbled, not humiliated, but softened. Simone de Beauvoir once said, "One's life has value so long as one attributes value to the life of others." And I would add, so long as we attribute value to the unseen, to the silent moments, to the questions that stretch us open, to the ache that stays even after the crying ends. That ache isn't failure. It's a signal. It's the soul's way of pointing to what is missing and has been missing for a very long time. Not just from your life, but from our entire way of being. It's not that we don't believe in gods. It's that we don't make space for them. They don't live in temples anymore. They live in attention. And when attention is sold to the highest bidder, the divine becomes homeless. Not dead, just uninvited. The sacred used to be a presence. Now it's an idea, a word we scroll past, a hashtag on a photograph, a branding strategy for a retreat. But presence cannot be packaged. It requires stillness, and this world has grown allergic to stillness. Stillness is inefficient. It doesn't produce. It doesn't post. It doesn't perform. And so the sacred disappears beneath the noise, not because it is weak, but because it is patient. And we are not. We worship speed. We worship relevance. We worship the next thing. And in that chase, something inside us quietly stops glowing. We are told to manifest our desires, but not to examine them. We are taught how to win, but not how to bow. We do not know what to do with reverence anymore, because reverence is not efficient. Reverence makes you pause, and the world has no patience for pauses. But that pause, that sacred breath between the noise, that's where the soul waits. It waits in the unnoticed, in the forest that doesn't care for your schedule, in the cry that comes in the middle of the night when no one is watching, in the grief that lingers long after the funeral ends. That's where the sacred still lives, not in words, but in the spaces between them. Virginia Woolf once said, "The beauty of the world has two edges, one of laughter, one of anguish, cutting the heart asunder." We were meant to feel both, but the modern soul is trained to only chase one side of the blade, the polished one, the presentable one. And in that lopsided pursuit of constant light, we abandon what is real. We abandon the seasons of the soul, the dark soil that grows quiet wisdom, the necessary winters. We forget that silence is not a void, it's a womb. That mystery is not confusion, it is the place where meaning breathes. We have become spiritual minimalists, cutting away the messy, the difficult, the ancient languages of devotion. We keep only what fits our aesthetic, a crystal here, a mantra there, but no true surrender, no silence that costs us something, because true silence is not an escape, it is a confrontation. It is where the inner monologue stops performing and begins confessing. It is where the image we present melts into the truth we carry. And maybe that's why we avoid it. Not because we don't believe in something sacred, but because we're afraid it might see us. And even more terrifying, that it might not. Because what if you kneel and no one hears? What if you ask and no answer comes? What if you light the candle and the room remains dark? These are holy fears, not because they're irrational, but because they are honest. And the spiritual path has never been about certainty. It has always been about courage. The courage to sit in the dark without demanding the light. The courage to remain soft when the world tries to harden you. To pray even when you don't know who you're speaking to. To listen even when no voice replies. That is the posture the modern world has lost. We think faith is about answers, but faith was never about having answers. Faith was about making space. Space for silence, space for mystery, space for what cannot be named. Rabindranath Tagore once wrote, "Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings when the dawn is still dark." We live in a time that demands the dawn before it will sing, but the soul remembers. The soul remembers how to wait, how to kneel, how to feel the ache and not pathologize it, to name the hunger, not as brokenness, but as longing, not as illness, but as invitation. The ache is not asking to be fixed. It is asking to be listened to. It is the soul whispering, there is more than this. Not more to do, not more to chase, but more to feel, to remember, to return to. And maybe that's all we're doing here, not seeking answers, but seeking the courage to be quiet enough to hear what has not yet been said. What does it mean to live in a world where mystery is no longer sacred, only suspicious, where everything must be explained, labeled, proven, where awe has been demoted to a momentary aesthetic, where wonder is seen as childish and disbelief as intelligence. We are growing up too fast in all the wrong ways. Children ask questions that adults have forgotten how to ask. Why are we here? Where do we go when we die? Who made the stars? Does anything watch us when we sleep? And slowly, these questions get silenced, not with cruelty, but with exhaustion, with homework, with busy schedules, with a world that values output over awe. And somewhere in that silence, we stop asking, we stop wondering, we stop kneeling, we replace the infinite with the efficient, we replace God with productivity, we replace longing with entertainment, but none of these satisfy the hunger. They only distract from it. Nietzsche once warned, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But we've built an entire civilization without a why. We have every how, every hack, every tool, every solution, but no deeper reason to wake up, no North Star, no myth to carry us when the road disappears, because that's what myth once did. It didn't explain the world, it gave us a way to live in it. It helped us suffer with meaning. It helped us love with awe. It gave death a home inside of life. Now we hide death. We sanitize it. We hide grief too. Make it quick. Make it silent. Post a black square. Say, thoughts and prayers. Move on. But grief is not an error. Grief is sacred. It is one of the few things that can still make the soul tremble. That can make us stop pretending we are in control. And maybe that's why it feels holy. Not because it feels good, but because it breaks the spell of numbness. The sacred doesn't always whisper peace. Sometimes it arrives in a rupture, in a breakdown, in a scream you can't explain. And maybe that's what we're missing. Not comfort, but contact. Real contact. With the divine, with mystery, with each other. And that can't happen in a world that runs on distraction. You can't hear the sacred in a room that never goes quiet. You can't taste awe in a life that never slows down. You can't remember who you are if everything is always trying to sell you who you should be. There is something deeply violent about a culture that pathologizes silence. That turns rest into laziness. That makes grief a diagnosis. But maybe your sadness isn't a flaw. Maybe your emptiness is a form of clarity. Maybe the part of you that feels lost is the only part still searching for something real. The mystics called this holy longing, the ache that remains after all the temporary cures have failed. Carl Jung called it the void that only God can fill. But even if you don't believe in God, you know the void. It's the place in you that refuses to be distracted, that resists quick answers, that keeps whispering, "This isn't enough." And maybe that's not a curse. Maybe it's the soul's way of calling you home. But home is not always a place. Sometimes it's a posture, a presence, a willingness to sit in the dark without demanding light, to listen without expecting a reply. Because silence doesn't mean absence, it means invitation. And that's what the hunger is. Not just emptiness, but a doorway. But only if we stop trying to run from it. Only if we stop trying to fix it. Maybe the most honest thing we can do is stop pretending that we are full and start honoring the fact that we are hungry, not just for peace, but for presence, not just for healing, but for holiness, not just for knowledge, but for mystery. The world is loud, and yet something within us is whispering, not for more noise, not for more knowledge, but for the return of something we cannot name, something ancient, something intimate. something that does not advertise itself, but waits patiently at the edge of our attention. Call it God, call it mystery, call it silence, call it nothing, and yet feel its pull. You can feel it when you're walking alone and suddenly remember that you're alive. You can feel it in the presence of someone dying, that eerie stillness that feels like a truth too large for language. You can feel it when you hold a child and wonder, what part of them has been here before? It doesn't arrive with thunder. It does not demand belief. It does not beg to be found. It is not waiting to be worshipped. It is waiting to be noticed. And when you finally notice it, not in a church, not in a book, not in a ceremony, but in the quiet hum of your own being, there is a pause, a sacred kind of pause, not an answer, not a conclusion, but a stillness that asks nothing of you, only that you stay. Stay in the discomfort, stay in the awe, stay in the hunger without reaching for a cure. Because the hunger itself is holy. It means you're still alive inside. To be numb in a world like this is understandable. To be exhausted is reasonable. To be skeptical is intelligent. But to still kneel, metaphorically or otherwise, to still hope that something sacred lingers, that is courage. And maybe that's what this age needs most. Not more belief, not more systems, not more voices shouting answers, but more people brave enough to listen for what does not speak, to sit with the wound, to touch the hunger gently, to stop pretending we are full, and in doing so, not to recover an old religion, but to begin, slowly, silently, building a new kind of temple, not made of stone, but of attention, a temple within, where silence is the altar, where presence is the prayer, where the ache is not a problem to solve, but a sacred companion. This is not an ending. It is a return, a quiet return to what you've always carried, but stopped making time to feel. You don't have to believe in anything grand. You don't have to force yourself into faith. Just light a small candle in the dark and let it be enough. As Thomas Merton once wrote, you do not need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where it is all going. What you need is to recognize the possibilities and challenges offered by the present moment and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope. Let your courage be silent. Let your hope be slow. Let your faith be without form. And when the hunger comes again, as it always will, welcome it as a friend. Because sometimes what feels like a wound is actually an opening. And sometimes what feels like the absence of God is where the soul begins to speak again. If this has resonated with something quiet inside you, something you rarely speak of, but always carry, consider subscribing to this channel. Not for motivation, not for inspiration, but for reflection, for presence, for a return to what matters. This space is not built to fix you. It's here to hold you, to pause with you, to remind you, softly, that even in this noisy world, you are not alone in your hunger. Welcome back.